read this book yet, it's called A Woman of Faith, Evangeline, is in the back. We have a free copy for you, so definitely pick one up after you leave. And it's an extension of this great story of how God has been faithful here. So since we ran a little bit over, we want to get right into the next. So I'm going to, folks, come on in. We're going to do the Q&A with Lil. That was Lee and Bill combined. That was kind of weird. So Bill and Lee, you can both come up and we'll get you started here. So we're going to do the Q&A time. So welcome them up to the stage, folks. Yes. And I think Lee said that he had about 20 or so questions. So we're going to try to do as many as we can, but we'll keep it just to an hour. So anyhow, here we go. Let's see, this is for you.
Yes, and let's be clear. Lee has about 20 questions. I have 3. And I'm not kidding. So I think the best way to do this is for me to just have a front row seat to watch Lee do 3 or 4, and then I'll do 1 just as kind of comic relief, and then we'll get back to another 3 or 4 from you, and by the next thing you know, it'll be Tuesday.
I'm glad to share mine with you.
No, I looked over your shoulder at some of yours. I don't even know half those words, so we'll be just fine.
Oh, man. Well, thanks for spending part of your afternoon with us. We did get a bunch of questions. I think Jamie's right, about 20 or so. So we'll go till about, I guess, 2:30 or so.
Sounds good.
And see how many we can get through, if we can get through all of them. You ready to start?
I am
ready. You have any preliminary comments?
I beg your
Do you have
pardon?
any preliminary comments?
I just said them as I was on my way up the stairs, yes. Apparently, my subjects were clearly understood and explained. You're the one that's created all the mystery in life. And don't quote major agnostic key professor Archibald in his 38-page paper, because none of us know if you're making that up or not.
All right. Well, let's start here. Here's one addressed specifically to me. So, said, God is good at doing beyond what we ask or think. I assume God has used your books in amazing ways. Can you give us one example? Yeah, it's funny. I almost can't take credit for Case for Christ, because this is the way I look at it. I'm from Chicago. I'm a Cubs fan. And in Wrigley Field, if you hit a pop-up and it goes to the center fielder, it'll be caught, right? But in Wrigley Field, with the way the winds are in Chicago, the Windy City, sometimes they'll hit the ball and it should be caught by the outfielder, but the wind takes it out for a home run. And that's how I feel like God did with my book, Case for Christ. Because I wrote that book in 5 months flat, with all the travel involved and nights and weekends. And I hit the ball, I wrote the book, but the Holy Spirit has taken that so far beyond what I did to it and has done so many remarkable things. I'll give you a couple quick stories. Some of them are really funny. Like this one guy was an atheist astronomer. And he was, right after the book came out, it was in 1998, he went to Barnes & Nobles to buy an astronomy magazine. And so he goes up and he finds the astronomy magazine and he sits down on a bench and he sits on something. And he reaches down and it's a copy of Case for Christ. And he flips through it and he says, I don't believe this, I'm an atheist. And he throws it down. He said, it was like something inside of me said I need to read that book. So he picked up the book, he bought it, he read it, he came to faith, and wrote me a nice letter, and I ended up bringing him up to the publisher to talk to the staff and encourage the publisher and how God uses books. And in fact, I got a note from him just recently. He's now retired down in Kentucky, very active member of a Baptist church down there. So, you never know how God's going to use something like that. But my favorite story involves a guy named Robert. Robert was a wild living guy. He was a risk taker, very successful. He was a drunk. He had a woman in every city. He was a total narcissist. He actually owned 2 private jets, and he put his name on the tails of each jet. And he would take both the jets up. He'd be sitting in one, and the other would take off as well. And he would sip champagne and eat caviar as he looked through the window just so he could see his name flying through the clouds. That's a narcissist. That would be a pretty good definition of a narcissist. So he's in his upper 60s, and he's standing on the beach one day in Florida, and God spoke to him on the inside. And he said, Robert, I've saved you more times than you'll ever know. Now you need to come to me through my son, Jesus. And he's shocked by this because it was so distinct, it's so real. And he said, I don't even know who Jesus is. So the only Christian he knew was Frank Gifford. Anybody know that name? It was a sportscaster on CBS. And his wife is Kathy Lee Gifford. Used to be on the Tonight Show, or the Today Show. So he calls up Frank, said, Frank, I had this experience about God. Who is Jesus? And Frank said, read The Case for Christ. That'll explain it. So he got my book. He read my book. Anyway, Robert has a radical conversion to Christ. I mean, more so, probably the biggest 180-degree turn in a life I've ever seen. And he, when he was baptized, he shared his story, and 700 people came to faith at his baptism, having heard his story, and they came up. The pastor ripped up his sermon, said, you've heard the gospel. Anybody want to come up right now, receive Christ, and be baptized? 700 people came forward. So Robert lived a few more years after that. He ended up dying, and on his tombstone in Montana, he had engraved, believe in Jesus. Thousands of people came to his funeral. And you probably wonder, okay, wait a minute, who's this guy Robert, and why did thousands of people come to his funeral? Because nobody knew him by his name Robert. That was his real name. They knew him by his nickname, Evil. Evel Knievel, the famous motorcycle daredevil rider who became a radical born-again follower of Jesus. I remember he called me to thank me for writing the book. And I didn't know anything about this at the time. And my phone rings one day, and I answer. I say, hello, and the voice said, is this Lee? I said, yeah. He said, this is Evil. And I thought, Satan has got my phone number. Can he do that? Can he do that? And no, Evel Knievel. Oh, okay. So I used to have an Evel Knievel lunchbox, when I was little. So we became friends, and he had all kinds of... I tell you what, though, I tell this to young people a lot. His biggest regret was that he said, Lee, if I'd only come to faith as a child or as a teenager, I could have lived a different life. He had such regret over the life he had lived, and he would just lament that every time I talked to him. If I'd only come to faith as a kid, if I'd only, I could have lived for Christ. And I said, Evil, I know that, but you know what? God's going to use you to reach people you otherwise wouldn't be able to reach because of what he's done in your life. But he just lamented the fact that he didn't come to faith younger. So anyway, those are a couple stories from the Case for Christ. Should I do another one?
Yes, please.
This says Lee or Bill.
Yeah. Well, who's first? Oh, it says Lee.
All right. So for a non-believer, how does one address the common sentiment, if there is a God, why does he allow bad things to happen? Yeah, great question. And it is the number one question that people ask. I commissioned a scientific poll of Americans. And I asked a cross-section of American adults, if you could ask God any one question and you knew he'd give you an answer right now, what would you ask him? And by a factor of, 20 times more than any other question, the number one question was, why would a loving God allow pain and suffering? That's the number one question. And, the problem with answering this question is if you give a 5-minute answer, you feel like you're giving a 25-cent answer to $1 million question. And so you're always a bit hesitant. So I would say that in my book, The Case for Faith, I have about 55 pages where I deal with this. And so if you want a more in-depth answer, my book, Case for Faith, which I've just revised and updated, has a more in-depth answer. But I'll give you kind of a basic answer right now, because it is a totally legitimate question. The one thing you have to keep in mind when you consider this question is we have about 20 lines of evidence that point toward the truth of Christianity in an affirmative way. You have cosmology, physics, biochemistry, genetics, human consciousness, the origin of life. You have archaeological evidence. You have New Testament evidence. I mean, there's about 20 different lines of evidence that point toward the truth of Christianity. On the other side of the scale, you basically have this question, because it's the number one question. And so you have to keep that in mind, that this question is asked against a backdrop of a whole range of other evidence that supports the truth of Christianity. The other thing, I usually, if I'm talking to an individual about this, and they ask me this question, I always ask a follow-up question. They'll say, well, why would a loving God allow pain and suffering? And I'll say, that's a totally legitimate question, but let me ask you a question in return. Of all the possible questions in the universe, why did you ask that one? And then they get personal. Then they'll say, because my wife was just diagnosed with cancer. Or we lost a son at childbirth 3 years ago. Where was God in the midst of that? Now we really get to the issue, the emotional issue, the psychological issue, the personal hurt and pain that is prompting the question. And often that's where I'll deal with the issue. Because people in that situation aren't really looking for an intellectual response. They're looking for someone to be Jesus to them. And so I want to be Jesus to them and encourage them and pray with them and so forth. Because it's, not too many people ask this question purely out of intellectual curiosity. There's usually some reason they're asking this question. But let me give you the short answer, the way I see it to this question. First of all, God is not the creator of evil and suffering. What he created, he said, it's very good. It's very good. Here's the problem that we face. From eternity past, God has existed as the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, in the Godhead, in perfect relationship, a perfect loving relationship. And when God decided to create humankind, he wanted us to be able to experience love, because love is the greatest value in the universe. And so for us to be able to experience love, we have to be able to have free choice and free will. Why? Because love always involves a choice. When my daughter was little, she used to have a doll that had a string in the back, and it was called Chatty Cathy. I don't know if you remember this. And you pull the string and let it go, and the doll would say, I love you. That was a high-tech thing back in the 70s.
Whoa. Let's hear that impersonation of Chatty Cathy one more time.
I love you.
That is excellent.
But does that doll love her? No, of course not. It's a robot. It's programmed. It has to say that. It has no choice. Love must involve a choice to love or not to love. And so for us to experience the greatest value in the universe, love, to love each other, to love God, God gave us free choice. And what did we do with it? We turned our back on God. We've walked the other way. And we've introduced evil and suffering into our world. And the Bible says as a result of that, suffering and evil have entered into our world. It's affected creation itself. The Romans says creation is groaning, waiting for redemption, ultimately, for the new heavens and the new earth. And but it's a little disingenuous, I think. You can take your hand and you can feed a hungry person with it, or you can take your hand and shoot someone and kill them. But if you take your hand and shoot someone and kill them, and then blame God on it, I think it's a little disingenuous, right? He's given, there's no cartoon to say, I've seen the enemy and he is us. We have allowed evil and suffering to enter into the world. Now, God uses it for good. We see the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. What was intended for evil, God used for good. We know Romans 8:28. He says that he will cause good to emerge from those who follow him, even though we go through difficulties in life. He doesn't say it's going to necessarily be in this world, but he promises that he will cause good to emerge. He uses suffering in our life in many positive ways to draw people to Christ. C.S. Lewis said that pain is a megaphone that arouses our interest. How many times when everything's going great and everything's wonderful, we don't think about God that much. But how much are we praying and seeking after God when times are tough? And so God can use difficult circumstances. The Bible also says that it is through difficult times that we learn perseverance, that we learn courage. I mean, courage would be impossible to learn if we lived in a perfect world. There'd be no way to learn courage. So God can use difficult times in our life to sharpen our character, and so forth. So there's good that can emerge as a result of that. But anyway, that's kind of the short answer to that. But it's an answer, it's a question that deserves a longer, more involved answer. And as I say, the book Case for Faith, it's about 55 pages. It goes into quite a bit of detail on that. I'm trying to think of other books. I know that, I think Luis wrote a book. Didn't Luis write a book on suffer? I think he wrote a book on this topic. So you might want to go to Amazon, look up Luis Palau. And did he? Yeah, I think he did write a book on that. So, is that all right?
Yeah, actually, I would add one thing,
yes.
Just because I mentioned this yesterday. When I told the story about climbing Camelback Mountain, and I said you felt like you couldn't feel any worse than you felt right now climbing up that mountain, but then you get to the top of the mountain, and what was Gary's thing is so that you can look at the city of Phoenix in a way you have never seen it before. So it's the whole idea of even in the midst of all that pain, God is moving you in a direction where you're going to have a new perspective, a better perspective, a fuller, more whole perspective that you would not have had were you not required to make that painful journey up that mountain. So yeah, it's just kind of an analogy of especially the last part of your answer, which is just what I was thinking as you were saying.
No, that's excellent. It's a great illustration. I've had people say who go through real difficult times, yeah, I know the Bible says God can cause good to emerge from the difficulties and pain in our life, but you don't know what I've gone through. You don't know the pain that I've gone through. And my answer to that is, you know what? Think about it for a second. God has taken the worst thing that could ever happen in the history of the universe, which is deicide, the death of the Son of God on a cross, the worst thing that could ever happen, and he's turned it into the best thing that could ever happen, which is the opening of heaven to all who follow him. So if he can take the worst thing in the universe and turn it into the best thing in the universe, he can even take our sufferings and draw good from those as well.
Good job.
Oh, okay, thank you, sir.
Take another one.
All right, one more, and then you. You spoke about the creed as being, I can't read that word, something, as part of the proof of the resurrection of Christ. In this era of fake news, how would you address people, skeptics, who might say that the creed started out as fake news? That's a great question. You remember, if you were here, I talked about this creed that we have. It was developed, it's been dated back to within months of the death of Jesus. And it says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. And the third day he rose from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared, including skeptics. James, his half-brother, who was not a believer during Jesus' lifetime. And Paul himself adds at the end that he also came to faith. So that's this ancient creed that's been dated back to within months. Maybe it's false, this person's saying. What if it's false news? Well, that's why you use the tests of history. That's what historians do, is they try to take these writings from ancient history and apply different investigative techniques to try to determine, is it telling me the truth? And this passes. In fact, the historical credentials of this creed are so strong that one of the few Jewish New Testament scholars, Pinchas Lapid, said it may be taken as a statement of eyewitnesses. So this is a powerful bit of eyewitness-based history. Well, some of the reasons we don't believe it's fake news is, number one, it was a statement against their interests. When you make a statement that is potentially going to hurt yourself, then it's probably true, because you're not going to make up something if it's going to hurt yourself. And we have 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that confirm that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as they propagated this creed and this conviction that the resurrection of Jesus appeared to them. They had nothing to gain. They weren't awarded a house on the Mediterranean for proclaiming the truth of this creed. They were persecuted for it. That's number one. Number two, it was totally against what they were taught to believe. So it's not consistent with, oh yeah, this is what we've always been told and we're going to make this up. The Jews of the day were taught there was one resurrection. It happened at the end of time, and nobody's going to be resurrected in the interim. Totally unexpected, totally. And if you believe that back then you're denying an essential truth of Judaism, and you're basically going to face damnation in hell. So there was a lot to lose by passing on this creed and believing this creed. Those are a couple reasons why we don't believe it was just made up. It was against their interests, it was against their experience, it was radical and new and different. And you look at how early it is, the fact that it came so quickly. In the ancient world, according to A.N. Sherwin-White, the great historian, it took at least 2 generations of time passing for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. And so the fact that this comes so immediately is a strong indicator that it wasn't just merely a product of legendary development. So I think those are some reasons why we can trust this creed. And I tell you, this creed has... there's a famous German scholar who, sorry, our token German over here. There's a famous German scholar who ended up coming to faith because of this creed. Just the strength of this creed convinced him of the truth of Christianity. It's powerful, and I think it's a great piece of evidence in the chain of evidence that leads to the truth of the resurrection. All right, Billy.
Okay. A common struggle for many families is their college and young adult children who have fallen away from the faith. What are your thoughts and advice for parents in this predicament? Well, first of all, you're right. It's common. I mean, and that's the first thing, is we tend to think nobody's going through this like us. We're the only family, that has a rebellious kid at home, and I'm embarrassed to show my face at church, and I wouldn't dare tell anybody but my very closest friends, and have sworn them to secrecy. And it's like we're all in the same boat, pretty much. It's the family that's got the pristine holy factor going that's the unusual one, not the one that has, quote unquote, a person that's fallen away or a rebellious kind of person. So again, a comment I know I made at least once, probably more than once over this week in my talks, it's like this whole issue of, my guess is your kids know exactly where you stand on your Christian faith. You are one step short from mimeographing a statement of faith that you read aloud before you have dinner. I mean, it's very clear where you stand. So the issue isn't, I don't think they know my position. They know your position. The issue is, as my prof in seminary, Howard Hendricks, used to say, it's taking your faith and making it their faith. And Prof used to have this great illustration where he'd have up front 3 glasses of water, 3 different sizes, a big one, a medium-sized one, and a small one, and he had the biggest one filled with water, and he'd say, this is how you passing your faith on to the next generation, and he'd pour it, and of course, a large amount would spill. And then you take that next one, you talk about your grandkids, and it spills even more, and as only Prof could do. See, my friends, it's the principle of spillage. That as much as this stuff that you have, your kids aren't catching it all. And so what your responsibility is to make sure initially that they get that, but then you have to patiently stand by them as they make that faith their own. So the whole idea of it's not talking to them more, or in my case, I was wanting to talk to them not only more, but louder. Yes, maybe they didn't hear me, and thankfully I had other people say, yo, chill pill here, Bill, take it easy. They know what you're saying. Just back off a little bit. Love them. Let them see God through your life, and let them come to the place where they make your faith their own faith. Now, the one thing I would add to this is, there's many different ways to define they've fallen away from the faith. And by that I mean, my personal opinion is, if that includes your child living at home and kind of turning their bedroom into a drug den, I mean, to me, that's way beyond the pale. That's where the line should have been drawn. I love you. You always have a place here. But remember, it's my name on the place. And so there are a few rules that we abide by here to make sure that it's the way I feel comfortable living at home. I don't feel comfortable with you doing your drugs in the bedroom and then inviting other people and then them coming back out with bags. So if you want to do that, you're going to have to move out. I just can't do, and you can decide where in the sand you're going to draw that line, and it's hard because they may take you up on it, and they may move out, and you'll have many a tearful night thinking, I don't even know where he is. He's probably living in his car, or you know what? He's probably down at the homeless shelter that we support as a ministry. You know, at least God's using our dollars to give him a bed somewhere else. But I mean, that breaks your heart. It's like, he's my son, or she's my daughter, or whatever. But I think that line needs to be established so that, again, he knows, she knows what you believe, and they have to come back to the pain and suffering. They have to reap the consequences of the way they're living life. We're in a culture where consequences are really low key these days, aren't they? Nobody talks about that a lot. You know what? You broke the law. I'm going to put you in jail. First thought, I'll get a lawyer and get probation. I will never see a day of jail time because I got a good lawyer. You know, I mean, what kind of society is that? So you need to be clear in your stance, but you just need to love them and let them know that you love them, and you trust God that eventually it's going to come around. Kath and I were talking about this the other day in terms of, like, to my way of thinking, and I don't have the stats like you always have, but to my way of thinking, just anecdotally, personally, I see kids that come to faith later in life, or they fall away and then they come back to it. There's usually some sort of bottom that they hit before it becomes real to them. If everything's going smoothly, and I think that's one of the other questions is, what do you say to someone who feels like they don't need God? Well, they haven't lived life in the fullest yet. I mean, wait till the bottom drops out, then they'll know that they need God, and then it'll be there. As a parent, that's heartbreaking to think that one of my kids has to go through that scenario in order to get to God. But you already said they have free choice. They could have chosen him years ago, but they chose to go a different route. So you hear me talking in this answer. In one sentence, I'm really hard line, and in the other hand, it's like it's breaking my heart, and I'm crying myself to sleep every night. I think that's the push-pull of being a Christian parent. But that's the best I can offer you at this point.
Yeah, you know, we got a couple of questions along those lines, and you know, my son's gone off to college now. He calls himself an atheist, and you know, that's the reality of our culture these days. I mean, because it's popular to be an atheist these days. When I was an atheist back years ago in the 70s and early 80s, you didn't tell people you were an atheist. That was like, you know, you're a child molester or something. I mean, nobody would admit that they were an atheist. Now, it's the cool thing. And you have people go away to college, they come back at spring break, say, yeah, you know, Mom, Dad, I'm an atheist now. And, you know, we tend to panic as Christian parents. And I think the thing I try to tell people is don't panic. Pray for them. Make sure the lines of communication stay open. But my experience has been most of them will come back to faith through someone else. Yeah. Usually someone outside the family that's going to. So one thing I would say pray for is that God would bring a godly person into their life, a friend, someone at the job where they have a summer job or whatever, who can augment your efforts to lead them back on the right path. But oftentimes, it's not a family member that's going to do that. And that's hard because we want it to be. But, you know, I think the prayer element is essential despite that. So, along those lines, this is similar. It says, any ideas on icebreakers or where to start for neighbors or friends who have it all together? As you're saying, people in worldly terms are super nice, but avoid anything controversial like religion or politics. And I think there's another question along those lines. You know, what are you doing? It's a nice person. Their life is going along fine and so forth. And I think you answered part of that. I think there's lots of ways, though, we can kind of get into spiritual conversations in a non-threatening way. For instance, as Christmas comes up, be natural. You're talking to your friend and say, I'm curious. What were your Christmas traditions growing up? What'd you do? Did your family observe Christmas? Oh yeah, we did. We put up a Christmas tree and did all that stuff. Oh really? Did you go to church? Oh yeah, we'd go every Christmas Eve. The whole family would gather. And do you still go to church? Oh no, I gave that up. Why? What caused you to give it up? Oh well, and all of a sudden you're in a conversation. So you can start with something simple like that, and it can lead into a conversation over a period of time and open up some doors that you didn't think were there. And I think Bill's totally right that if your neighbor or your friend knows where you stand, if they know you're a believer, know you're a Christian, when the tough time does come, you're going to be the person they call. When their kid gets arrested at 2 a.m. and they're thinking, who do I call? Oh, yeah, I remember my neighbor, Bill's a Christian. I got to call Bill. They're going to call you. And so part of it is just live out your faith in front of them. Let them know this is serious to you, that you take it seriously, that it affects your life, your decisions, your worldview, your attitudes, your relationships, your priorities, and so forth. And knowing that, as tough times may enter into their life, you're probably the person they're going to reach out to. But I think these simple ways of getting into conversations like the Christmas thing, it's kind of a non-threatening way to do it. Or to ask the question, if you could ask God any one question and you knew he'd give you an answer right now, what would you ask him? That's just an interesting question. And you can leave it to them whether they want to get serious about it or joke it off. But who knows? There might be an opportunity for a conversation. So let's see. That's the same one. Question, since the release of The Case for Creator in 2004, are you planning to update this book? Is there information that you can share with us that would further strengthen the case for a creator? I would like to update the case for creator. I don't know, I'm 70 years old. I don't know how many years I'm going to be doing this.
Whoa, you're old.
I'm old.
You're older than me.
Yeah. You've been 70 for 3 days or something.
You've been 70 for 6 months, Grandpa.
But assuming God gives me a few more years, I may very well do that. There's been a lot of further discoveries in the area of science that point toward the truth of the existence of God. I still think the 3 strongest areas are cosmology, physics, and biochemistry. Cosmology, the origin of the universe. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. We know the universe began to exist, therefore there must be a cause behind the universe. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight at our session. That points toward the existence of a supernatural creator. Where there's been a lot of new discoveries since the book was written is in the area of physics. That is the fine-tuning of the universe. The universe is fine-tuned on a razor's edge so that life can exist in a way that just makes a joke of the idea that it was by chance. I talked to one famous physicist once, and I said, Dr. Strauss, is it possible that all of this fine-tuning of the universe has happened by chance? And he said, Lee, when you run the numbers, we physicists have a term that we use to describe what the odds would be. I said, really, what is it? He said, ain't going to happen. So, but, it's like if you go out at night and you look at the sky, and instead of seeing stars, you see 60 giant dials in the sky, or up to 100 giant dials in the sky. And they could each be set at any one of trillions of potential settings. And yet all of these dials in the sky are perfectly calibrated so that life can exist. That is a picture of what modern physics tells us. And there's been more and more discoveries in recent years of these parameters, of these dials, so to speak, that blow your mind. I'll give you one real quick. The force of gravity. Everybody knows what the force of gravity is, right? You drop something, it falls to the ground. Well, the force of gravity is calibrated at the exact right place so that life can exist. So imagine a ruler across the entire known universe, 15 billion light years, a ruler, broken down in 1-inch increments. That represents the plausible range along which the force of gravity could have been set anywhere along that range. And yet, it happens to be set at the exact right spot so that life can exist. How precise is it? If you were to change the force of gravity 1 inch compared to the 15 billion light year width of the universe, intelligent life would be impossible anywhere in the universe. That's just one. And that's not even the most incredible number. I mean, there's numbers that just are so astronomical, the odds, it would just blow your mind. So I think that there's been a lot of new discoveries in that area that can be talked about. But the third area is biochemistry, that is genetics. What is DNA? It's information. If you have 100 trillion cells in your body, if you were to open any cell and unwind the double helix of DNA, it would be 6 feet tall. Embedded in that is a 4-letter chemical alphabet that spells out the precise assembly instructions for every protein that you are made of. It's information. Whenever you see information, whether it's a newspaper, a computer code, a painting on a cave wall, wherever you see information, there is always, always, always an intelligence behind it. Nature can produce patterns. If you walk down a beach, out here along Cannon Beach in the wet sand and you see ripple marks, you would say the wave action has created those ripple marks in the wet sand. Nature can produce that kind of pattern. But if you're walking down the beach and in the wet sand you see John loves Mary and a heart around it and an arrow through it, you wouldn't say, oh, the waves made that. Why? Because that's information. It's a message with content. There is more information in every cell in your body than you would find in 200 years of the Sunday New York Times. In every cell in your body. Where does information come from? That's one of the leading edges of research these days that points toward the existence of a creator. So if you like science and you're looking for really an updated book on this topic, especially those 3 areas, I'll recommend one. Dr. Stephen Meyer, who got his PhD from Cambridge University on the origin of life, has written a new book called The Return of the God Hypothesis. The Return of the God Hypothesis. That is a very current, up-to-date, scientifically rigorous, and yet easy to understand book that deals with this kind of evidence. So, I may or may not update mine. Maybe his book will take the next leg of the journey. I don't know. But there is new stuff that's coming out that augments and supports and strengthens the case for a creator. Should I do another one? In a skeptical world, this says evangelistic serving. In a skeptical world, how should Christians reflect the scripture, let your light shine before others so that they see your good deeds and give glory to your Father, Matthew 5:16. Yeah, talked a little bit about that the other night, but I do think that the way in which we serve other people is a powerful testimony to the strength of our faith and the truth of the Christian life. And, so that, there's a million different ways to do that. We have in our churches and in parachurch ministries, things like Samaritan's Purse, things like local food pantries, and all kinds of ministries that we can volunteer in to reach out and to serve people who are in need. But sometimes it's the simple things that we can do for a neighbor who's hurting, who needs help, who needs someone to drive them to the hospital to see their husband who's had a heart attack and she has no transportation to and from the hospital, and say, I'll be glad to give you a ride. I mean, so simple gestures of reaching out and offering to serve people at their point of need that points people toward God and often opens up those spiritual conversations. What makes you willing to do this when nobody else would help me? Well, because God first loved me. He's changed my life. And, 20 years ago, I probably wouldn't have cared. But you know what? God loves you. He cares about you. And I do too. And if I can serve you, I'm glad to do it. And if I can tell you about this Jesus that changed my life, I'd love to do that as well. So I think the key to it is, though, to somehow communicate what it is that motivates you to do this. Otherwise, you're just a nice guy, which is not bad to be a nice guy, but you want to, I think, let people know what is it that motivates you, and it's Jesus. what you do.
Can I hitchhike on that?
Yeah.
Somebody wrote a question, and it would tie in perfect with this. And whoever did this, thank you for inquiring. Bill, are you still actively working with corporations as a motivational speaker? What are the outcomes? Are there opportunities to share your faith? Can you give some examples? I've been on my own since 1988 and have, believe it or not, made a living every year by two simple things, speaking and writing. And that little railroad track of two things has both divided up into two circles. I've been doing speaking in Christian venues, churches, conference centers, but then I also felt like God wanted me to get into the corporate world. And doors began opening and come up to where we are today. I've been with, over a dozen of the Fortune 100. And what am I doing in front of the Fortune 100? What do I have to say to Disney or Microsoft or Ford or, American Express? And yet God opens these doors, but it was very carefully worded that they're not hiring an evangelist. They're not hiring a minister. They're not hiring someone who's going to sell a particular thing. They're hiring someone who can help them. I've mentioned more than once here about balance being the real watchword in my life, helping people achieve balance in their lives. And so I would go into these corporate settings and I'll take whatever I can get. And they would say things that are kind of, like, you're the only guy we're paying to be at this conference. Everybody else is part of the team and they're doing it for free. So we're going to give you the worst hour. So they put me on like right after lunch. And lunch, of course, is the all-you-can-eat pasta bar, right? So everyone's like, and it's like, well, you better be good or else everybody's falling asleep. And so I try to, with a lot of humor and a lot of energy, talk about balance in life. And I talk about the importance that faith will play into that. Now, that might be the entirety of what I say in terms of I don't give the gospel the plan of salvation, don't give an invitation. It's just very subtly but pointedly presented to the audience. Well, Kath has been in these audiences. She can attest it. As soon as you say that, you can find every Christian in the room. They're a little higher up in the seat, and they're like, the little wink, wink, nod, nod, and, go get him, boy, go get him, And in terms of outcomes, since we don't have a raise a hand or come forward invitation, I don't know anything about that, but I'll get these Christians who come up to me and say, you have no idea how timely your presentation is. We've been working with this one guy. Matter of fact, he's right over there. Don't look now. He's in the green. He's wearing the green tie. He says, this guy's life is a mess, and the believers in his office have been circling around and praying for him, and you just gave it one more step of credibility that it's something that he should investigate. I'm so glad you were here. And those are the kind of things that float our boat, because we realize we have to play by the rules in order to be paid by Walt Disney or paid by, to make this presentation. But it's such an amazing thing to be able to do that. Kath and I were just in Chicago last month at, we don't normally do these. This was a black tie affair. She looked lovely in her gown. I look like a penguin in my tuxedo. But Traffic Club of Chicago, 1,000 transportation executives, presidents of trucking companies, railroads. It was an amazing group. And to be able to talk freely up to the point that we know is acceptable for them. And again, even with 1,000 people in the room and everybody in a tuxedo, I could still see all the Christians kind of step up a little closer to the edge of their seat, and it was really good. So yes, I'm still doing corporate presentations and love it. And if I can come to your group, I'd be glad to do it, because it's really a highlight for us. And like I said, the speaking, we get to do the corporate things and the ministry things, the Christian things, and then in the writing, I've written 14 books and currently feel like, I think I've said everything I want to say at this point, but I don't necessarily want to stop writing. So as I mentioned yesterday, God brought the ghostwriting into the world. And so I've been ghostwriting solidly for the last few years, like, 5-6 books a year. It's just been such a joy to have people come alongside that I can help them work on a book. I did a book last year for a dear woman whose dad was in World War II and wrote her, as a little girl, a letter every day. First letter came from stationery that says Hickam Field, which would have been Pearl Harbor, and it had a bullet hole in the piece of stationery. Isn't that incredible? And he wrote her every day, and when she got to be about she was 6, because he wrote on the envelope that particular day, do not open this letter until you're 16. 10 years. And of course, it was a letter that a father would say to his daughter about becoming a woman and facts of life and, whatever you would call it. Beautifully written. He lived. But this whole book of letters, it's just a really warm father-daughter kind of tribute to her dad. And I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people. I mean, God brings these people into our lives. It's just really, really great. So our ministry's expanded a little bit. Some of it is still the same, but again, with some of the people that we're meeting through the ghostwriting stuff, it's really fun. Out of the blue, I got an opportunity to do not 1, not 2, but 3 study guides for a guy who has this Case For series. He's got a case for everything. He even has a case for one of his friends to write a study guide for him. So Lee's been very generous that way to have me write some of his study guide material, which has been really fun for small groups, by the way, which is just great stuff. So how did we get off on that? We got off on that on...
I think somebody asked about it.
Evangelism, yeah. It's like, I know what it was. And it reminded me, another Portland favorite, Joe Aldridge, used to say, we're letting them hear the music of the gospel before they hear the words. Now, they got to hear both. But if I can get into a corporate group and at least give them the music, then I know these guys that are surrounding these people are going to help them hear the words as well.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, question. A friend is doing a Bible study, a book study, currently titled Soul Keeping. How do you describe soul versus spirit? It's interesting. In the Bible, I think there are about like 200 references to soul, but there's never any place in the Bible that defines the soul. Because God just kind of presupposes that we all know we have a soul. So he doesn't try to prove that we have a soul. He presumes we all know we have a soul. And generally, soul and spirit are synonymous. Usually, soul refers to when it's when we're living in our body, and our spirit then separates from our body. But it's talking about the same thing. So our soul is our, it would be the equivalent of our consciousness, our mind. It's the center of our introspection, of our volition, where we make decisions. It's our beliefs. The question is, where does the soul come from? There are a lot of people who just believe we're a body. We don't have a soul. And I think the corroborated cases of near-death experiences I mentioned last night do show that we do have a spirit that does continue to live on, at least after our clinical death. And there is good evidence that we have a spirit or a soul. Where does that come from? There's different theories among theologians. Some believe that God directly brings the soul into us at an undefined point when we're in the womb, whether it's at conception or whether it's at birth or whether it's at first heartbeat or whatever, that's when God directly brings the soul to fruition in us. I don't believe that, because God is perfect, God is pure, God is holy, God is sinless, and yet our soul, ever since the fall, is not. It's tainted by sin, and I don't think a perfect God implants a somewhat tainted soul into people. It doesn't make sense to me. So there's another belief that Jonathan Edwards and many other scholars hold, which is called traducianism, which means that our soul is introduced at the same time that at conception. When we're conceived, our body is conceived, our soul is conceived through our parents. Our God does it, but through our parents as we're conceived. And this has implications for the abortion issue. Because if you're a traducianist, as I am, you believe that a child has a body and a soul at the moment of conception. And therefore, to kill that child would be a violation of the commandment, do not murder. There are those who believe in God directly implanting the soul. They don't know when that is, and they'll say, oh, it's not until birth, and so it's okay to abort a child before then because it's not fully human. It's just a body. It doesn't have a soul. That's how some Christians will justify abortion. The problem with that is if you don't know when that soul is then implanted by God, wouldn't you want to play it safe? Because we're dealing with a human life. So you'd want to, I would think, defend it all the way back to conception. I'll give you an example. My good friend, grandparents were driving in their car in North Dakota in 1940s on a highway in North Dakota. And they're speeding along the highway, and they see a box in the road. And they slow down a little bit, and they're thinking, what do we do? Do we hit the box? It might be kind of fun to watch the box cardboard fly everywhere. Do we go around? What do we do? So they decided to pull off the road and go over and get the cardboard box out of the road. But as they approached the cardboard box, the flap came open, and a little boy came scampering out of the cardboard box. And they found the parents and returned the boy and so forth. But the point is, they had played it safe. Who knew what was going to be in that box? What were the chances there going to be a boy in that box? So minuscule. One chance in 1,000, maybe. One chance in 2,000, there'd be. But given even the small odds like that, when we're talking about human life, the wise thing to do was to pull off the road and take the box off the road. And similarly, if you don't know when God is implanting that soul, I would think you would say, I'm going to consider it from conception just to play it safe because we're dealing with a human life. But so that's the difference between traducianism and what's called creationism. It's different than, Genesis creation stories and so forth. This is, it's used the same term, but it's whether God directly implants it at some point or whether it is transmitted by the parents at the time of conception. There are scholars on both sides. Wayne Grudem, who's a well-known theologian, believes in God implanting the soul at some later time since conception. Jonathan Edwards, as I said, is a traducianist. Traducianism is his person. Does that make sense? Anyway, that's a long answer to the soul and the spirit, but that's what the soul is. Interestingly, I have a whole chapter on the soul in my book, Case for Heaven, by the way. Cultures around the planet, going back to antiquity, have always believed in the soul. Isn't that interesting? Every culture, since time began, has believed in the existence of the soul. It's only in modern times that some people question that. Do they have a motive to question it? Well, yeah, because if we don't have a soul, we're not really made in the image of God, and, therefore, certain commandments may not apply. So, One more. Billy, you got one? Or do you want me to do it?
Well, I can comment on this. Yes, my mother is a Christian, and she has caused a lot of harm during my childhood and adulthood, and we are currently, quote, low contact, unquote, to protect my children and myself. She often tells me that as the child, I'm meant to honor my mother, Ephesians 6. Am I living in sin by maintaining low contact? Am I supposed to have more contact to honor her, even if the contact feels toxic and could be harmful to my kids? I think you're doing exactly what you should do. I think you should protect your kids, and you should protect yourself. And anybody who's ever been under the under the umbrella of someone else who is toxic knows how debilitating that can be. The way you're phrasing this question and with the terminology, I'm assuming that there might be a professional involved who probably encouraged that this would be the case. That's something I would include in this decision is, does a Christian counselor, does a therapist say that this is probably the best? But I know, Kathy and I, from our own experience, know how toxic people they're just a cancer. They just eat you away slowly but surely. And if you have to pull yourself away, and I notice it's not no contact, but it's low contact, okay? You're not saying I don't ever want to see you again. You'll never see your grandchildren again. But it's not, hey, every Sunday afternoon you can count on us being here to be ridiculed. I mean, that's just not right. So I'd say you're doing the right thing.
Yeah. I agree.
Now, here's Jamie to do, closure with very good. You're taller than I remembered now that I'm thinking about it. So I'm not going to say anything bad about you. These are great. Here's some questions for you. You can look at.
I'm not going to take these questions.
Let's hear it for Jamie and Lee. Didn't they do a good job?
Yes. Let's hear it for these two.
Yes.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. What a great thing. We could probably sit here all day and listen to them talk and banter, right? Super great time. I just want to make one announcement and we'll let you go. We are doing, or actually I said Lee is doing a book signing today at 4 o'clock in the lobby. So make sure you want to come do that and grab a book and have them sign and we're just going to do it for an hour. Just a real quick run there. So make sure you come there. Thank you all for coming. I hope you had a great time and enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you again later.